the morning Ethan Walker arrived at the Riverside KD9 Rehabilitation and Adoption Center, the sky was the color of ash, not the dramatic, cinematic kind of ash that signals something poetic, just flat, gray, indifferent sky. The kind that doesn't care whether you look at it or not. Ethan couldn't see it, of course. He hadn't seen anything in 2 years, 8 months, and 11 days, but he had learned, in those 900 and some odd days, that the sky had a feeling to it, even when you couldn't see it, a weight, a texture. And on that particular Tuesday in November, it felt like something waiting to happen. He stood outside the entrance for a moment longer than necessary, his white cane resting against his leg, his other hand pressed flat against the metal of the door, as if testing whether the building was real. The cold came through in a single clean pulse. Behind him, his ride. A volunteer driver named Patricia who smelled permanently of lavender and who asked too many questions. Said something about picking him up at 3. He nodded without turning around. He heard her car pull away. Then there was just him, and the door, and the distant, layered sound of dogs. Dozens of them, calling to each other through walls and corridors and wire. He pushed through. The smell hit him first. Antiseptic, the sharp medicinal bite of whatever they used to clean the floors. Underneath it, the earthier sense of wet fur and kibble, and something metallic he couldn't name, but recognized the way you recognize a song from childhood. Not fully, just the outline of it. His boots found the linoleum, and he listened to the way the sound changed around him, building a rough map of the space, a reception desk, somewhere to his left, a hallway ahead, open ceilings by the echo, the hum of fluorescent lights somewhere above. A woman's voice came next. "Mr. Walker, I'm Karen. We spoke on the phone." Her footsteps were quick, efficient. She had the measured warmth of someone who genuinely cared about her work, but had learned to keep a professional shell around that care, because the work required it. She shook his hand with both of hers, and he noticed she didn't make any of the usual flinching adjustments people made when they realized the cane was real and the blindness wasn't metaphorical. He appreciated that more than she would ever know. "We've got several wonderful candidates lined up for you," she said, already moving. "Trained service animals, temperament, tested, all of them great with." "What's that?" Ethan said. He had stopped walking. Karen turned. "I'm sorry." "That sound." He tilted his head slightly to the right, toward a corridor that branched off from the main hall. "What is that?" There was a pause, a beat too long. The kind of pause that is itself an answer. That's one of our isolated animals," Karen said carefully. "Not available for adoption. That wing is restricted." The sound that had caught his attention was coming in waves, a low, guttural roar that built and collapsed and built again, punctuated by the crash of something heavy against metal. A body, probably, throwing itself against a cage door with the kind of fury that went beyond instinct. It was not the sound of an animal that was simply aggressive. Ethan had been around aggressive animals. He had been around aggressive people. This was different. This was the sound of something that had once trusted the world completely and had been broken by it, and now had no language left except violence. He recognized it the way a person who has drowned recognizes the sound of water. "I'd like to hear more about it," he said. Karen walked him to the restricted wing, under what appeared to be significant internal protest. She talked as they moved, and the story came out in pieces, the way difficult stories always do. Not in a straight line but in fragments, each one dropped reluctantly. Each one revealing a little more than the last. The dog's name was Thor. He had been a military working dog, attached to a special operations unit, handler designation classified but confirmed deceased. The details of the mission were not available to Karen, but the aftermath was something she had witnessed herself. Thor had arrived at the facility 14 months ago via military transport, still wearing his tactical vest, still coated in dust that nobody had dared to brush away, because the first person who tried had needed stitches across the back of the hand. He had not let a single human being within 3 feet of him since. He had attacked 2 handlers, sent a volunteer to urgent care, and broken through 2 separate containment arrangements before they finally built a reinforced isolation unit specifically around his dimensions. Every animal behavior specialist who had assessed him had used some version of the same phrase beyond rehabilitation. The name on his file had been amended over the months. Originally it read Thor, MWD, Belgian Malinois, 5 years, retired. Now beneath that, someone had added in red marker dangerous, no contact, Do not approach. He was extraordinary, Karen said quietly, and there was something in her voice that betrayed how much it cost her to use the past tense, before. His handler, Marcus, they were together for 3 years. Whatever happened out there, Thor came back and Marcus didn't. And Thor he's been trying to tell us about it ever since. Only we can't understand the language. Ethan didn't say anything. They had reached the door to the isolation wing. Even here, with a solid wall between them and the animal inside, the sound was different. More immediate. Thor must have sensed the new presence in the corridor, because the rhythmic crashing had stopped, replaced by something more deliberate, a sustained low warning. Karen put her hand on the door. Mr. Walker, I really should take you back to the... Open it. She did. She didn't want to, but she did. The isolation unit was a room within a room. A reinforced cage occupying most of the space, surrounded by a 4-foot buffer zone that was demarcated with yellow tape on the floor. Nobody crossed the tape. Everyone understood, without being told, that the tape was not really there for the animal's protection. Thor was at the front of the cage. Ethan couldn't see him, but he felt him. There are things that do not require sight. The displacement of air, the particular quality of silence that another large living creature creates, the way a space feels occupied versus empty. Thor was filling that room the way a storm fills a field, with presence that pressed against you and demanded acknowledgement. He was not making any sound anymore. He was simply watching. Ethan stepped forward and crossed the yellow tape. Behind him, Karen made a sharp sound of alarm. He ignored it. He crossed the tape and kept walking until his cane touched the cage bars, and then he stopped, standing roughly 18 inches from a Belgian Malinois who had, by documented record, attacked every human being who had come this close to him in the past 14 months. He didn't reach out. He didn't make any sudden sounds. He just stood there, breathing slowly, his hand at his side, his cane gripped loosely. Thor watched him. The growl, when it came, was low and constant. Not an escalation, not a warning shot, but the kind of baseline sound that the dog had been producing for over a year, because it had become the only state he knew. He growled. He stayed alive. He growled some more. The world kept disappointing him. He growled harder, but there was something else now underneath the growl. Ethan heard it and went very still. It was the faintest sound, a catch in the throat, something between a whimper and a question, something so small that Karen, who was standing against the wall 15 feet away, probably couldn't hear it at all. It lasted only a second. The growl reasserted itself immediately. But it had been there. Ethan had been a SEAL for 11 years. He had learned to hear the things that didn't want to be heard. Hey, he said quietly. Not to Karen, not to the room. I know. Thor went absolutely silent. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere far away, another dog was barking. In the isolation unit, there was nothing. No growl, no crashing, no warning. Just a man with a white cane and a dog with a broken record for violence, standing 2 feet apart in a room that smelled of antiseptic and old grief, both of them utterly still. Then, Thor made a sound that Karen would later describe, in a statement she wrote for the center's records, as something she had never heard from an animal in 15 years of rescue work. It was not a whimper. It was not a growl. It was something in between. A sound that had no clean category. A sound that lived in the space between recognition and grief. Between the part of the brain that identifies and the part that feels. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Thor's body language changed. Not all at once. Not a dramatic softening. Not the movie's version of the moment. More like watching ice begin to melt from the inside, where you can't see the process directly, but you can see the structure becoming something different. He took 1 step back from the bars. Then he took 1 step forward. He pressed his nose through the gap in the bars and touched Ethan Walker's hand. Ethan didn't move. He allowed the contact, standing perfectly still, his heart going at a rate he would not have admitted to anyone. The wet warmth of Thor's nose against the back of his hand lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then the dog withdrew, circling once, twice, tightly. The way dogs do when they are trying to figure out what they feel. He stopped circling. He lay down. Not in the back corner, where he always retreated. Right there at the front of the cage, 18 inches from Ethan Walker, with his chin on his paws and his eyes fixed on the man who smelled. Karen would later theorize, like somewhere Thor had been trying to get back to for over a year. Ethan crouched down so they were at the same height. "My name is Ethan," he said. "I lost someone too." They brought him a chair eventually, because he wouldn't leave. Karen sat across from him with Thor's file open on her tablet, reading out loud the portions that were available for civilian review, skipping the classified sections that appeared as black bars across the text. Thor listened with his eyes open when Karen's voice got clinical. Wait, vaccinations, behavioral incident log. His ears flattened slightly, the way ears do when language is happening, but meaning is absent. When her voice changed, when she got to the parts about Marcus. A name, she said carefully, like handling a splinter. Thor's ears came forward again. Marcus Hale. Ethan said when she mentioned the handler's name. I didn't know him, but I've known men like him. He told Karen. And therefore, in whatever way it works between species, he told Thor. About the night that changed everything. He didn't use clinical language. He had been through enough therapy to know all the clinical language. And he had been through enough of life to know that clinical language is a way of describing something while keeping it at arm's length. And he was tired of keeping things at arm's length, so he told it the way it had actually happened. The patrol. The building. The device that no one had seen. The sound, which was not the dramatic movie sound but a flat, enormous pressure, like the whole world swallowing. Waking up in a hospital in Germany with a bandage over his eyes, and a doctor's voice saying words that his mind kept refusing to process. The weeks of bargaining, the months of refusing, the long, grinding passage from rage to something quieter and worse. A place where he couldn't find a reason to put on shoes in the morning, where the apartment he'd moved into felt like a waiting room, where he drifted between sleep and waking without any clear preference for either. He lost 2 men that night, good men, men with names that he kept in a part of himself he didn't open often, because it was not safe to open often. Thor, who had been lying with his chin on his paws, lifted his head. He made the sound again. That uncategorizable sound, the one that lived between languages. He pressed his nose once more to the bars, not to Ethan's hand this time, to his sleeve, to the old jacket Ethan always wore, a worn tactical jacket from his last deployment, not because he couldn't afford a new one, but because he couldn't make himself give it up. Because the fabric still held something he needed even though he couldn't name what. Thor smelled the jacket for a long time. His breathing changed, slowed, his eyes half closed in a way that was not aggression and was not sleep, but was something that lived between those two states as well. A kind of surrendering, not to weakness, to something he recognized, something his body remembered, even when his mind had been trying to burn it out. Ethan felt the dog's warm breath on his wrist through the bars, and did not move for a very long time. The request, when Ethan made it, was calm and simple, and caused immediate institutional panic. I want to go inside with him. Karen stood up. She looked at the cage, at Thor, at Ethan, back at the cage. She did the rapid internal calculation that every responsible professional does when someone asks them to do the thing that all their training says not to do. She said she needed to check with the director. She said there were protocols. She said Thor had injured multiple people in enclosed spaces. She said all the correct things in the correct order. Ethan waited. Halverson, Director James Halverson, a compact man in his late 50s, who had built this facility from the ground up, and whose operational philosophy could be summarized as risk management with emotional intelligence, arrived 9 minutes later. He took one look at the situation. He read the expression on Karen's face. He looked at the file he was carrying, which he had pulled up on his way over. He looked at Thor, who was still lying at the front of the cage with his chin on his paws, which was already a behavioral anomaly significant enough to merit a report. He looked at Ethan Walker. Absolutely not, he said. What followed was not a fight, exactly. Halverson was not a villain. He was a man who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had learned that boundaries existed for reasons. And one of those reasons was that this particular dog had sent 3 people to the hospital. He laid out his reasoning clearly, without condescension, and the reasoning was sound. The liability alone, the safety protocols, the fact that Thor's behavior in the past few minutes was, yes, unusual, but an anomaly in a pattern of danger, was still part of the pattern. Ethan listened to all of it. Then he said, I hear you. I understand every word you said. I'm asking you to let me in anyway. Halverson stared at him. I'm not asking you to make a promise about what happens after. I'm not asking you to rewrite his file or change any policy. I'm asking for 5 minutes inside that cage with a Belgian Malinois who just laid down in my presence After 14 months of attacking everyone who came near him, 5 minutes. And if anything goes wrong, it goes wrong to me, and that's my choice to make. Thor, as if following the conversation, had raised his head and was watching Halvorsen with an expression that the director would later admit, in a conversation with Karen, that he prefaced with the phrase, "This stays between us," he could only describe as pleading. They opened the cage. They had a handler standing by, with a brake stick. They had a second staff member with a tranquilizer loaded and ready. Halvorsen positioned himself at the door with his hand on the frame. Karen stood beside him, barely breathing. Ethan stepped inside. He moved slowly, with the particular deliberate calm of someone who understood, on a cellular level, that their body language was the most important communication they would ever engage in. He didn't reach for Thor. He didn't rush. He crouched down in the center of the cage. Not at the bars, not against the wall, just in the center. And he put his cane on the floor beside him, and he put both his hands in his lap, palms up. Thor watched him for 11 seconds. Karen counted. Then the dog stood. He approached from the side, not straight on, in the looping, investigative path of an animal that is curious but not yet committed. He sniffed the cane. He circled wide around Ethan's back, sniffing the jacket again, spending a long time at the collar where the fabric was most worn. He came around to the front and sat down. He looked at Ethan's face. He tilted his head. That gesture that dogs do when they are trying to process something that language cannot handle. Then he walked forward those last 18 inches and pressed the full weight of his enormous head against Ethan Walker's chest. The sound Thor made then was not a growl. It was not a bark. It was a long, broken exhalation. The sound of something that has been held very tight for a very long time and has finally, in one exhausted instant, let go. His legs began to tremble slightly, the way legs tremble when relief and grief arrive at the same moment, and the body does not know how to metabolize the combination. His tail, which had not moved in any affectionate direction in over a year, moved once. Just once. But it moved. Ethan raised one hand, slowly, steadily, and placed it on Thor's head. Behind him, at the cage door, Karen had stopped breathing entirely. "I've got you," Ethan said softly. "I've got you." Halvorsen denied the adoption paperwork that afternoon. He was polite about it. He offered alternative dogs. 4 of them, all excellent animals, all thoroughly assessed, all capable and gentle, and ready for placement with a visually impaired veteran. He outlined the benefits of each one. He spoke about the training support the center could offer. He was, in every measurable way, professional and reasonable and completely immovable. Ethan filled out the preliminary adoption form for Thor anyway, and left it on the reception desk. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the third morning, he arrived and Karen met him at the door with an expression that told him something had happened. But not what. She walked him to the isolation wing without explanation, opened the door, and stopped at the threshold. Thor was already at the front of his cage. He had been there when Karen arrived 40 minutes earlier, which was itself notable, because Thor did not usually come to the front of his cage at all, preferring the rear corner, where he had the wall at his back. Now he was pressed against the bars facing the corridor, ears up, body oriented toward the door, waiting. "He heard your cab," Karen said quietly. "He started doing this when he heard your cab." Ethan stood at the cage for a moment. Then he said, "Director Halvorsen needs to see this." The fire started on a Wednesday. No one was supposed to be in the East Wing storage corridor at 3:47 in the afternoon, which is why no one noticed the electrical fault in the utility panel behind a stack of improperly stored cleaning supplies, until the smoke was already visible from the main hall. The alarm went off 11 seconds after that. By the time it registered in the central monitoring station, the fire had a 2-minute head start. The evacuation was swift. The staff had practiced it. Animals from the primary adoption wing were out in under 4 minutes. Carriers moving through the parking lot while handlers called to each other over the noise of the alarms and the accelerating crackle of something burning badly. The volunteers moved efficiently. Karen coordinated from the main exit, clipboard in hand, voice steady. Ethan was in the socialization yard at the far end of the facility when the alarm went off. He stood up from the bench immediately, cane in hand, turning toward the building, processing the sound. Not just the alarm, but the other sounds layered beneath it. The shift in air pressure and temperature that even a sighted person might miss, but that someone who had learned to navigate the world through everything except sight picked up immediately. Something was wrong in the East Wing. The alarm was coming from the East Wing. Thor was in the East Wing. He heard Thor before he had consciously completed that thought. Even over the alarm, over the sound of controlled chaos in the parking lot, over the distant hiss of something burning, he heard Thor. Not the familiar aggressive bark, but something else. Something with a completely different register. A sustained, rhythmic sound that was not aggression and was not pain, but was the sound of an animal that was fully alert and fully present and calling for something specific. Ethan was already moving toward the building. Karen caught up with him at the side entrance and put a hand on his arm. "Mr. Walker." "Ethan, stop. We have to wait for the fire department." "Where is he?" "The East Wing." "But the corridor." "How long before the department gets here?" She didn't answer, which was its own answer. He heard the sirens, distant but coming, and did the math that his experience automatically performed. Several minutes. The East Wing had already been burning for 3. Thor was in a sealed metal cage in a concrete room in a corridor that was filling with smoke. He would not survive waiting. He also would not survive being found, later, by Ethan Walker's accounting of himself. "Which door?" he said. Karen said nothing for 2 seconds. Then, left from the main entrance, past the isolation monitoring station. "The corridor is 12 feet. Thor's room is the 3rd door on the right. The door has a standard pull handle, not a lock. The cage inside has a standard slide latch." Ethan nodded once. He went in. The smoke was not yet the killing kind. Thick and black and close to the floor. But it was building. He registered the heat as information, not threat, and moved through it the way he moved through every space, with his hands on the wall, counting doors with his fingertips, his cane finding obstacles before they found him. The sound of the alarm was overhead, loud enough to disorient, but underneath it, if he filtered, he could hear Thor, steady, rhythmic, oriented toward Ethan. He counted doors. 1, 2, 3rd on the right. The handle was hot but not yet dangerous. He pulled. The door gave. Thor heard him enter and his sound changed immediately. Not louder, but sharper, more focused, the way a signal changes when the receiver gets close enough to lock on. Ethan followed the sound across the room, the heat pressing harder now, the smoke lower, his eyes watering reflexively even though the eyes were not the relevant instrument here. He found the cage with his hand. He found the latch, standard slide latch. He had been told. He worked it. The cage door swung. Thor hit the door as it opened and was out in the same motion. But he did not run. He stopped beside Ethan. He pressed his flank against Ethan's leg, hard, the way a trained guide animal positions itself, and he began to move, not away from the smoke, which would have been the simple animal thing to do, away from the smoke and back toward the corridor from which Ethan had entered. He moved steadily, matched to Ethan's pace, his body in constant contact with Ethan's leg, stopping when Ethan stumbled, pressing harder against him when the smoke thickened and Ethan's pace slowed. Ethan put his hand on Thor's back. He let the dog lead him out. There is a thing that happens in extreme situations when two beings who have been operating independently suddenly become a single coordinated unit. When the separateness dissolves, and what replaces it is something faster and more efficient than either entity alone. It happens between soldiers who have trained together for years. It can happen, apparently, between a blind veteran and a military working dog who found each other 3 days ago, in a burning building, in the space between two kinds of loss. Thor brought him out through the side door and into the cold air, and then sat down. He sat down right there, planted his haunches firmly on the asphalt 4 feet from the building's wall, and he would not move again. Ethan dropped to one knee beside him. He could hear the fire department arriving, the sudden full, throated scream of the siren closing the distance that had seemed impossibly large 2 minutes ago. And Karen's voice, somewhere close, saying something that her professional composure could not entirely contain. Then her hands were on his shoulders, and she was saying something about an oxygen mask, and he was hearing her from a slight distance, because most of his attention was on the 110 pounds of Belgian Malinois that was pressed against him with the full weight of his body. Trembling, not moving his chin on Ethan's knee. Thor had not left his side. He was trembling and coughing slightly from the smoke, and he smelled of something acrid and chemical, and he had not moved half an inch from Ethan Walker's leg since the moment they emerged from the building together. Ethan put both arms around the dog. Thor made that sound again, the one without a category, the one that lived between languages. Halvorson arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, not because anyone had asked him to, because Karen had called him from the parking lot, her voice doing something he had never heard it do in 7 years of working together. And he had gotten in his car, without fully deciding to, and driven there, and was now standing in the corridor outside the emergency bay, where Ethan Walker was receiving oxygen therapy and being assessed for smoke inhalation, and where a Belgian Malinois with a documented history of attacking staff was sitting beside the gurney with his head on the blanket over Ethan's legs, not growling, not lunging, not doing any of the things that his behavioral record said he did in the presence of strangers in enclosed spaces. A fire department lieutenant had tried, once, to move the dog away from the patient. He had the bruise on his forearm from where Thor's shoulder had knocked him back. Not a bite, not an attack, but a body block, deliberate and precise. The movement of an animal that was not being aggressive, but was being entirely clear about what was and was not going to happen. Thor was not leaving that gurney. Halvorson stood in the corridor and watched through the glass and held Thor's folder in his hand. The folder he had brought for no reason he could name. The folder with the red marker notation across the front. He stood there for a while. Karen came and stood beside him. He went in for the dog. Halvorson said, "Yes." A blind man went into a burning building. Yes. For a dog that, he stopped. For a dog that came back out to guide him. Karen said, "Yes." Halvorson looked at the folder. He looked at the glass. He watched Thor's tail make one slow, wide arc and then settle again, the dog never taking his eyes from the man on the gurney. "Get me a pen," Halvorson said. Karen had one ready. She had been ready for this. He opened the folder to the page with the red notation. He took the pen. He drew a single line through the word dangerous, clean and definitive, the line of a man who has updated his information and is not ashamed of having been wrong. Below it, in his own handwriting, not a stamp, not a form, but his own handwriting, which was careful and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write by hand before keyboards existed. He wrote one word. He capped the pen. He handed the folder back to Karen. He said, "Process the adoption paperwork, expedited." The day Ethan Walker and Thor left the Riverside K-9 Rehabilitation and Adoption Center, it was raining lightly. Not the dramatic kind of rain, the fine, soft kind, the kind that doesn't soak you through but makes everything smell clean and slightly possible. Ethan stood at the entrance with his cane in one hand and Thor's lead in the other. Though the lead was not taut, had not been taught since the moment he clipped it, because Thor was walking beside him in the precise position of a guide animal without anyone having asked him to, without a single day of formal training, as if the work was something he had simply recognized and stepped back into. Karen watched them from the door. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the image didn't already say better. They got into the car. Thor sat in the back seat with his shoulder pressed against Ethan's arm, and did not look out the window once. The weeks that followed were not without difficulty. Ethan Walker was not the kind of man who used words like healing without putting quotation marks around them in his head. The actual process was more like renovation, not rebuilding what had been destroyed, because you cannot rebuild the same thing twice, but tearing out what was broken and finding what was still structural and building something new around it. Thor was not a trained guide dog yet, and the work of getting him there was real work. Thor learned, or rather remembered, what it meant to have a job and a person. The behaviors came back in pieces. First the positioning, the side-by-side walking, the alerting, then the more complex things guiding around obstacles, stopping at curbs, managing space in crowds. He learned quickly because he had never been a slow learner. He had been a grieving one, which is different. Ethan learned things too. He learned that his apartment, which had felt like a waiting room, felt like something different now. Like a place where two living beings were existing together, which is a small thing, and also, if you have been living alone with your losses long enough, an enormous one. He learned that mornings, which had been his worst time, were now structured around Thor's routine. Feeding, a walk, 15 minutes in the courtyard where Thor would patrol the perimeter once before coming back to sit at Ethan's feet, confirming, Apparently, that the perimeter was secure. He learned that some nights, when the particular dream came, a cold nose pressed against his hand in the dark was, inexplicably, sufficient. Not sufficient to undo anything. Sufficient to get through the night. Thor learned that not all buildings were dangerous, though he remained appropriately cautious about any that smelled like the particular combination of chemicals associated with the worst night of his working life. He learned that children were not threats, a relearning that took 6 weeks of careful, patient exposure before Thor understood, through accumulated evidence, that small humans who smelled of fruit juice and chalk were not the enemy. He learned that people who came to the apartment were extensions of Ethan's world, and therefore worth protecting, rather than challenging. He did not lose the protective instinct. He simply learned to calibrate it. He was not a soft dog. He was a dog who had been through the worst thing a working dog can go through, and had come out the other side as something harder and more precisely dedicated to the one person he had chosen, which was, as the trainer observed dryly, exactly what Ethan Walker needed. Not a gentle companion, a partner. The ceremony was held on a Saturday morning in early spring when the light had finally gone from gray to gold. The seasonal shift that always arrives later than you expect and is always more dramatic than you remember. It was not a large ceremony. It was held in the parking lot of the Riverside K9 Rehabilitation and Adoption Center, which was not a glamorous venue, but which was the correct one. The fire department was represented. The police department had sent a community liaison officer who brought with her a medal, a round disc of silver and blue on a ribbon, the kind given in formal recognition of acts that saved lives. It was made out to Thor Walker, which was what his papers now said, because Ethan had amended the adoption registration, and the facility had filed it without comment. Karen was there, Halverson was there, standing slightly apart from the group in the way of men who are feeling something that their professional persona does not have a protocol for. Thor sat beside Ethan while the community liaison officer gave a short speech about what had happened in the east wing of this building 4 weeks earlier. She used words like courage and instinct and the bond between humans and animals, and they were the right words, applied carefully. She described what the first responders had found when they arrived: a blind man and a dog emerging from a smoke-filled corridor together. The dog in the precise position of a trained guide animal, the man's hand on the dog's back, both of them moving at the same pace, unhurried, as if the building collapsing around them was simply a navigational challenge to be solved together. When the medal was brought forward, the community liaison officer knelt down in front of Thor with the ribbon and loop in her hands. Thor looked at Ethan. Ethan gave a small nod. Thor lowered his head and allowed the medal to be placed around his neck. He looked down at it once, this metal disc on a blue ribbon, and then he looked back up at Ethan and his expression. And it was an expression, not anthropomorphism, not projection, but the genuine readable configuration of the face of an animal who is communicating. Was the expression of a creature who has found the place he belongs in, is, at last, ready to stop running from everything that isn't it. Ethan reached down and put his hand on Thor's head. "Good boy," he said. The crowd around them was quiet. Even Halverson said nothing, which was its own kind of speech. In the months that followed, word spread the way true things spread. Person to person, in the language of "I heard about this, and you have to hear it too." A short clip Karen had taken during one of their visits. A 30-second video of Thor guiding Ethan through the center's courtyard, with the precision of a dog who had been doing this specific work for years rather than weeks, found its way online and traveled with the velocity of something that people needed to see, not because it was dramatic. It was a quiet 30 seconds, two figures moving together in the early morning light, but because it said something, without words, that people had been trying to say with words for a long time. Letters came, letters from veterans, from their families, from people who recognized something in Thor's story that was also their story. The being who had come back changed. The being who was called dangerous or broken or too far gone, who turned out to have been none of those things, only hurt. Only waiting for the specific person or thing that would make it safe to remember who they were. Ethan did not call himself a spokesperson. He was a man who went to the grocery store with his dog, and went to the park on Tuesday mornings, and went to sleep at night with a Belgian Malinois on the floor beside his bed. the dog's breathing steady and even, a sound that had become, in the months since that first November morning, as necessary to Ethan's sleep as silence had once been. When people asked him how it had started, how he had known, what had made him go toward that caged, furious animal when everyone else had gone the other way, he said the same thing each time. He said, "I heard something in the sound he was making. I've made that sound, not out loud, but I know what it sounds like when it's in you. And I figured if I could hear it in him, maybe he could hear it in me." Thor, on the occasions when Ethan said this, would look up at him with his amber eyes and his scarred muzzle, and the medal he wore on formal occasions, and press his nose against Ethan's hand, and the contact would last exactly as long as it needed to. The world calls some things dangerous because it does not have a better word for what it means. When something has been hurt past the point of ordinary expression, it draws lines on floors and writes words in red marker and calls this risk management, and it is not wrong to do so. And it is also not the whole story. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room is not the animal in the cage. Sometimes it is the grief that has no address, the damage that has no form, the two kinds of brokenness that are beneath all the noise and the file notes and the behavioral incident logs, simply calling to each other from opposite sides of a wall. And sometimes, not often, not reliably, not as a policy recommendation, the right person hears the call. Ethan Walker heard it. Thor answered, and in the space between those two things, in the 12 inches of charged air between a white cane and a cage bar, something that the world had decided was finished turned out to be, in fact, only beginning.